Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I'm so glad that you've all responded to my emails about if you don't show up. Don't you wish you'd been here in August for Dewey Owens? Yes. I have good news. We're actually getting 24 autographed copies of Where the Crawdads Sing. Oh, they won't be first, but they will be autographed, so good news. But tonight, we are welcoming a debut author, David Dow. So exciting. Every time I type, my autocorrect makes you David Down. I've worked so hard to get the N off the end. But
well, it's either that or David Rao. That happens a lot also. So I'm accustomed to the autocorrect not recognizing my name.
uh-huh. So David comes to us with an interesting background. He is worked in the Innocence Project, but I think we're in Texas, right?
Yes, the Innocence. It's the Texas Innocence Network.
Network, sorry.
Yes,
we
that's
have
all right.
we have an Innocence one here, and we've done events for that. Patrick, what's it called? Do you remember when we?
I think it is the Innocence
It's
Project.
the-
Yeah,
the
y'all have
project,
y'all
isn't
have
it?
y'all have the Innocence Project here, and it's for many years one of the guys who worked at it was a guy named Rob Scher, and Rob left a couple of years ago, but it's a very good organization.
So Texas has an interesting history with inmates and so forth. There was a very good book by Mary Willis Walker years ago about the Texas, about executing criminals, and I can't remember exactly the thesis of it, but you could do it if someone was convicted of one thing but not another, and a guy got convicted for the wrong thing, so he was going to be executed, and the object of the investigator was to convict him for the other things, so he wouldn't be executed.
Right.
Is that, are you familiar, Patrick? Do
I'm
you
not
remember
familiar with that particular case, but that strikes me as extremely plausible.
Well, it was, now Mary Willis Walker wrote some really interesting books, and then she just like vanished. I hate that when authors, you're just so happy with them, and one day
Yeah.
you realize they're gone.
Yeah.
Not for any particular reason. So anyway, Patrick, what was your reaction to Confessions of an Innocent
I
Man?
thought it was fascinating on all sorts of different levels. I'm really interested to hear, just to hear about your own background and your own work in this field, and kind of what inspired you to kind of try to wrap your head around it in
Yes.
fiction.
Yes. So I've been in this field now for 25 plus years, representing death row inmates. And I wrote, after many years, after 20 years of being in academia and writing academic books and academic articles, 9 years ago I wrote a memoir. And I found it to be a really rewarding experience, and the book, I thought, I was very flattered by the attention that it got critically and the content of the reviews and the publications that reviewed it. And then 4 years later, I wrote a second memoir that was again about my work, but also about my wife's father-in-law, who was dying from melanoma at the same time that one of my cases was happening. And we also had a dog that at the same time was dying from acute liver failure, and it had been the first dog that our son had known. And while I was very pleased with those books and flattered, as I say, by the content of most of the reviews, I'm not an author who pretends like I don't read reviews, or who in fact doesn't read reviews. I do read reviews, and I am flattered by the good ones, and the negative ones oftentimes have something in them that I feel like I can learn from. I'm irritated when I read a negative review and it seems to me that the author didn't even read the book. But other than that, I can generally find something even in negative reviews that makes me shake my head and think, yeah, that's smart, and I pay attention to it. But in the case of both of these books, some of the reviewers were complaining about the fact that I had changed some of the facts, and I did change some of the facts. So I would say that a crime happened in San Antonio when really it happened in Del Rio. Or I would say that the murder victim was a tall white woman when really it was a short Hispanic male. And the reason that I made those sorts of changes is because these were my clients, and a lawyer has a duty of confidentiality to his clients, and that duty of confidentiality lasts forever, even after the client is executed. And so I would just change little facts that I thought were irrelevant, where my intention was to make it somewhere between difficult and impossible for somebody to sit down at a computer and just type in the facts of the crime and then figure out which case I was talking about. So I was complaining to my agent one day. I called up my agent who's represented me now for, gosh, a long time, close to 20 years, and is my agent, but he's also my first reader, well, my second reader, and a dear friend of mine. And I said to him, Simon, I'm just so irritated. I don't know why these people are holding me to a journalistic standard. I'm not purporting to do journalism here. I said, I think I'm just going to have to write a novel so that I can change these sort of facts and nobody can complain about the fact that I'm making stuff up. And Simon said, I think that's a great idea. Do you have one in mind? And I said, yeah, let me tell you what I've been thinking about. And I told him about the basic story that is this book. He said, I think you should write it. So I spent the next 2.5 years writing.
Well, it's funny because the book, you know, it's a lot of different things at the same time. It's very educational in one sense, you know, it's part kind of philosophical, philosophical book, part love story. You know, as Barbara was saying, it's a really unique love story, you know, because the wife is gone.
Yeah.
It's also a thriller, but there's a lot of really insightful things, you know. How did you manage to wrap your head around getting all of that into one book?
Yes. First of all, I just want to thank you for that, because I also, at least, was trying to write a book that was all of those things. I wanted it to be a love story. I wanted it to be a story about male friendship, because there are a number of male friendships in the book. I wanted it to have the verisimilitude that comes from my having been in this world for as long as I've been in this world. And I also wanted it to have narrative tension, even though it's not really a mystery in the conventional sense. You know really from the beginning not exactly what's going to happen in the granular level, but at a more general level you know more or less what's going to happen. And so it's not a mystery in the conventional sense where you're having to whip through the pages to figure out who did it, and that's really what is driving the book. And so I was trying to do all of those things, and I think the reason I wanted to do all of those things is because the editor of my first memoir asked me to put something else in the book when we were still writing the book. And I said to him, no, I don't want to put that in the book because I'm saving that for my next book. And he said, there might not be a next book. And I think he knew a lot of authors they were one book and that was it. He knew that there are a lot of people who plan to write 2 or 3 or 4 books, and they write one book, and that's the last book they ever write. And so when I was writing this book, I already actually know what my next book is going to be about, but I hadn't written it yet, and so maybe I'll never actually write it. And so when I was writing this book, I thought, you know what, I'm going to follow that editor's advice, and I'm not going to save anything. If it belongs in this book, it's going in this book. And I thought everything that's here belongs here.
You know, I think your experience writing the 2 memoirs really shapes this book, don't you, Patrick? Because in its own way, it is a memoir. It's a memoir of this man's marriage, of his, how much he loves his wife and what happened. So that now explains, it's an interesting structure. It's not, Patrick and I are both desperate to find something we haven't read too many times before. We've had these conversations. There's so many books that are so much alike, especially right now in this whole trust no one psychological thing. It's just like one after another. So it was really a delight to read your book and find something that was a different reading experience. But I must say, until just now, I hadn't really thought about the effect of your writing memoirs in the way you shaped this novel, but now I see it.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I did think of it first, actually, as a love story. I mean, it's obviously there's
well, she's dead, so
yeah,
she's
right.
Dead.
She's dead, and obviously there's the book has 4 parts, and she's only alive for one of those parts, and so for 3 of the 4 parts of the book, it's a love story where one of the members of this love story no longer present. But that was still just how I thought of it throughout.
One of the things I thought was great is that it really presents. I should probably have you give a basic setup to the book without spoilers, of course. But the relationship, it's very. There are a lot of interesting details that just added realism to it. It's an unconventional relationship in some ways.
Yeah.
And there's a particular medical condition that, as far as I know, has made its first appearance in crime fiction. Maybe not.
Maybe. I actually have run across it in something, but I can't recall if it was in crime fiction. But
it
yeah.
plays an important role in their relationship.
Yes.
And can you give them just a basic setup?
Sure. The basic setup of the book is that the central character is named Raphael Jata, and he is born in Mexico to a very poor. Well, I take that back. His parents live in Mexico. He's an anchor baby. He's actually born in Laredo, and his father brings his pregnant mother to the United States just so that he can be an American citizen, because his father knows that. And I should say, by the way, that I wrote this part of the book before Donald Trump got elected president. So none of this is I'm going after the president type of story. This was written when anybody who was going to bet would have bet that Donald Trump would not even be the nominee, much less the president. So there's not really anything political about that, other than that my mother was born in Mexico and then grew up in Laredo. So the reason the story gets set in that way is because I had a lot of personal experience visiting relatives in Monterrey, Mexico, where to this day I have relatives, and then visiting my maternal grandparents for weeks at a time in Laredo during the summer. And so that's why I set it up that way. And so he's born in Laredo, and then he comes to the United States to go to college, and he goes to college here, and then he goes from college to culinary school because he wins an award that pays his way to culinary school, not because he has some driving desire actually to be a chef at that point, but it turns out that he's got this talent and he's good at it. He works his way down to Houston. He opens a restaurant that opens to great critical acclaim both in Houston and Texas and nationally for that matter. And then he meets, because one of the people who comes to his restaurant is a wealthy philanthropist who is a divorcee who has an older son, and he meets her in his restaurant, and the two of them initially get to know one another because she is so taken by his talent that she wants to invest in him and have him open other restaurants, but he doesn't want to do that. But during the course of their negotiations, they make a connection and they start to date, and they eventually get married. And then, if this is not a spoiler alert because all this happens in the first 12% of the book, she is murdered. And almost all the time that a married woman is killed in her home, she's killed by her husband or partner. The same is true in reverse, by the way. Almost all the time that a married man is killed in his home, he's killed by his spouse or his partner. It's just that there are way more women who are killed in domestic homicides than there are men. So it would be very normal for the police to immediately focus on him as a suspect. And then when you add on top of that, that he's Mexican and she isn't, that she's 14 years older than him, that she is very, very wealthy, and he is not poor, but nobody would characterize him as very, very wealthy. And then finally, on top of everything else, and this circles back to the unique, well, perhaps not unique in fiction, but at least unusual condition that she has. She having sexual relations is painful for her, and so he's having sex with other women. So you add all those things together, and does anybody doubt that he's the one who committed the murder? And so that's the basic setup of the book.
Therese, is that how you say her name?
Teresa.
Teresa. Okay. She's very. I really like her. She's not on stage for very long, but when they're kind of having some of their first little conversations, there was this one thing that she said I thought was really, really neat. She says, what I learned is that every successful person is extreme in one way or another. Some drink too much, some chase too many women, some churn through employees. If a woman is content to be with a moderately successful man, then she can find many wonderful potential partners. But if she's drawn to an extremist, she must make sure his extremism is benign, or she will suffer every day. That's just
Yes.
That's a great quote. I think it really really captures her well.
Yes, she is, of course, I think, a brilliant person. She's somebody who inherited a little bit of money and turned it into a huge amount of money, and she's also somebody who she knows what she knows and she knows what she doesn't know, and she doesn't, unlike a lot of men who I think pretend to know things that they don't, she is extremely willing to acknowledge that there are just some things she doesn't know. She doesn't have any ego that requires her to pretend to know things she doesn't. So she knows what she's good at, and what she's good at is identifying what parts of the country are about to explode in terms of population. And so she gets there before the people come, and she builds subdivisions. And it's either instinct or intuition or some deep understanding of the economy that very few people have, is just a talent that she has, and she knows she has, and she knows what she's good at. And the other thing there are a lot of things I like about her, honestly, but one of the things that I like most about her is that she, despite the fact that she has enormous wealth, is completely down to earth, and is mostly just content to give it all away, to give it, to museums and battered women's shelters and other types, universities, and other do-good type organizations.
Doesn't he come up with an app that he uses to feed the homeless?
He does, and so the reason he goes to culinary school is because he wins a competition when he is in college, where he builds an app that allows soup kitchens to get all of the food that would otherwise be thrown away in big restaurants, and then to just type into this app what they have, what was delivered there that day, and how many people they want to, they think they're going to need to feed the next day, and then the app tells them what to cook. But the trick of the app, aside from just being able to know recipes with all of those ingredients, is that it also has to be something that anybody can do, so that the volunteer who's cooking in the soup kitchen doesn't need to have chef training in order to be able to prepare these meals. And so what you need, besides the app and besides the buy-in from the restaurants, obviously, to give all of their food that they would otherwise throw away, is you need refrigeration to keep the stuff, and then you need vans to get the food from the restaurants to the homeless kitchen. So he builds that, and then of course what she wants to do is buy all of the vans and the refrigeration, and she doesn't tell him. At some point, I think he says that he found out years later that as soon as he described this app that he had developed to her on one of their early conversations, he found out that she had contacted her foundation staff the next day and told them all to let the relevant authorities in a bunch of big cities know that she would buy all of the vans and all of the refrigeration for them if they would all use this app in order to feed the homeless people in their cities. So not only was she doing something great, but she didn't even want him, who turns out to be her husband, to know about this act of generosity. Yeah.
So what you succeeded in creating here is that book where you really mourn the victim. It's just heartbreaking that she is killed. She's such a great person, and their relationship is so good. You don't always find that in a crime novel. Sometimes the victim is, just sort of a focal point of the murder, but
or you
not.
learn that she has a secret life that's kept from you.
But you don't necessarily you know, you don't necessarily wish that this person had survived, but I think a lot of the power of this book is how much he misses Teresa, and then how much you miss Teresa as you read the book and get to know her.
Yes, and I think that obviously the other way in which this book grows out of my memoirs is that he is somebody who, if he had never met Teresa, would not have known what he was missing. And because they're so completely different, he would never have expected that even if he was going to end up with somebody, he would have ended up with somebody like her, because they're so different. And that's a little bit my own life. I mean, I'm married to somebody who I would never in a million years have thought I was going to end up being married to, and I've been lucky and happy in that way. So that I think also that just comes from my own experience in certain ways.
So you married well.
I did very well, but what I talk about in one of my memoirs is how one of the things about my wife's biography that surprised me is that she's German, and her parents came to the United States as adults. Her father had a PhD in chemistry and worked as a chemist for Shell his whole life, first as a chemist, and then if you're good at chemistry, what they do is they take you out of the lab and put you in management. And so
Just like the Army.
really just like life.
Yeah.
You're a good academic, they put you in the dean's office, and so it's the same thing everywhere. And so it was very odd for me the first time I met her parents to hear these people talking in, first of all talking German, but even then when they switched to English, talking in thick German accents. My family was murdered in the Holocaust, so it was an extremely strange, surreal experience for me, and so I would never have guessed that I was going to end up with somebody like that. So it was easy for me to write a character like Raphael, who is just completely mad about this person who he would never have thought was somebody he was going to end up with.
And then he gets introduced to the court system, and it's a real eye opener. You learn. I mean, no secret to anybody that often the courts don't work quite right, but it's very fickle. How quickly he has a certain degree of naivete. He thinks, well, I'm innocent.
Right.
So, and then there's also a lot in this book, obviously, about the Texas, the death penalty.
Yes.
What kind of informed your thoughts on that particular subject? When did you first kind of?
So I've been representing death row inmates for, as I say, 25 years or something like that. And there were a couple of things that I wanted to do in writing about the trial in this book in order to show that the criminal justice system is broken in a lot of ways, but not just show it from the same point of view that it's always shown. The simple way to show that the criminal justice system is broken is by focusing on the wealth of the defendant. If you're a poor defendant and you're counting on court-appointed lawyers, then you're in big trouble. And it's not because court-appointed lawyers are bad. Once upon a time in Texas and elsewhere, but especially in Texas, court-appointed lawyers were truly dreadful. That hasn't really been true for about the last 20 years, but the problem is that if you're a court-appointed lawyer, what it means is that the court has appointed you, and therefore the court is paying you, and the court means the judge, and the judge is an elected official. Judges in Texas are elected, and so if you're a judge presiding over a death penalty trial, and you pay the defense lawyers a lot of money, then you're definitely not going to get reelected, because your opponent is going to run ads that talk about how much money you pay these lawyers who are representing this cold-blooded murderer. So the way that the system is set up is that there's institutional pressure that results in poor people not getting quality defenses. That's just an undeniable fact. And I didn't really want to take that tack, which is true, but also just seemed to be, in a way, too predictable, even though it's true. So I really wanted to have a defendant who has what is essentially, at the time, infinite wealth. And so he was not going to have that same constraint, because until the time he got convicted, his wife's wealth was his wealth. Once he got convicted, it was all taken away, but he wasn't yet convicted when he hired his lawyers. And so what I really wanted to do in writing about the trials was to write more about how it is that innocent people even end up in prison in general, but on death row in particular. I think that the reliable estimates are that somewhere between 5 and 9% of people on death row are innocent. And that number accords very well with my own personal experience. My team and I have represented probably 115 people over the last 25 years, and 7 of the guys and gals I've represented, I believe to have been innocent, because the 7 includes 1 woman. Most of my clients have been men. Most people on death row are men, and it would be precious for me to keep saying him or her when talking about the death row population, because 99% of it is male. But in my own experience, one of my clients who I think was innocent was a woman. So I've represented 110 people. I think 7 are innocent. 2 we had exonerated. They walked out of prison altogether. 1 died of natural causes. 2 were executed because, even though I believe they were innocent, the people who mattered, that is, the judges, were not persuaded. And 2, the last chapter's not written. Those cases are still ongoing. And so I've always been interested in trying to figure out how that happens. If you're watching a movie about a wrongful conviction, the likelihood is that the police and the prosecutors are going to be portrayed as sinister and evil, out to get the person who gets convicted. And I don't really think that's what happens. And so I want to write a book where the person who gets convicted, who didn't have anything to do with it, gets convicted for reasons that I think are really more truthful to what happens. And what happens is that the police and the prosecutors, they get committed to a narrative before the facts warrant it. So in this particular case, if you're somebody who shows up at a murder scene and it's a married woman and she's dead in her house, the first thing you think is it's the husband, because it's almost always the husband. And then if you just add all of these other details that I added, the age difference, the wealth difference, the race issue,
The jury selection.
the jury selection,
That's really
the
interesting
jury
too.
selection, right? Then that's it. And so it's not that the police and the prosecutors said, this Raphael Jata is innocent, but we don't like him, we're going to convict him anyway. What it is that they got committed to the story that he did it before the evidence warranted that degree of commitment. And this is common in the criminal justice system, but it's also common in human psychology. People get committed to a version of what they think is the truth, and then every piece of evidence gets filtered through their commitment to what they think is the truth. So facts that support their theory, they incorporate, and facts that don't, they tend to cast by the wayside.
Invested in it.
They're vested in it.
Yeah.
But
They're
there's a lot of evidence, that people would rather believe a myth than the truth.
Yes.
Myths that are busted, people don't actually want to give them up.
Yes.
So that's been explored. The other factor I thought that played into his conviction, it's a mistake to naively think that if you're innocent, that's going to be just enough. If you ever are in that position, and I hope none of you ever are, don't be naive about it. You really do want to have good legal representation. And a lot of people get convicted because they think, I'll just tell the truth,
Right.
And that isn't good enough. It really isn't good enough.
And he rushes it to trial when they could have prepared him.
Yeah, you really do need a lawyer, to represent you. And in his case, as he could afford it, it was especially naive.
I think that you're exactly right, obviously. You're exactly right. But the problem that you always have, even as somebody who is innocent, is that if what I just said a moment ago is correct, which is that the people prosecuting you really believe you're not innocent,
Right.
they really believe that you're guilty, then if you're a defendant, you're not a professional. You're not a professional defendant. You're not a
person who
Mostly
professionally.
you're not, although
you
there are some that
there
are.
are some. There are some.
Right.
Yes, you're exactly correct.
Right.
There's, or at least they become professionals.
Yeah.
So O.J. Simpson was like a professional defendant, but that's unusual. And so even if you're telling the truth, it's still very easy for somebody who is convinced that you're not telling the truth to make it look like you're not telling the truth. It's a very easy thing to do because you don't remember the sorts of details that nobody remembers, but the people on the jury think, oh, well, of course people would remember where they were 2 days ago.
Well, and juries are, by default, more inclined towards the prosecution than the defense, and more inclined to think the police did their job.
And that's particularly true in
You
death
know.
penalty cases.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's a lot. I used to do a lot of trial work, but I did mostly personal injury work. I never represented a capital case, but thank God.
Yes.
But you know, juries. It's an adversarial system. What I do know from not doing death penalty cases, but oftentimes in court, the lawyer who tells the best story, regardless of the facts, actually will win, can persuade a jury in the face of even rational evidence. So there's a lot of drama to it. I think it's one reason lawyers make great authors. You know, they practiced telling stories. I really do.
Yeah,
you
no,
know,
a trial is in fact a story, and I talk in the book about how when you are telling a story, you have to have credibility with the people to whom you're telling the story. You need to have those people believe you. And one of the things that happens in a death penalty trial is that the way a death penalty trial works is that it's really two trials. They're called phases, but for all intents and purposes, it's two trials. And so you have a trial where the jury decides whether you did it. And then if they decide, yeah, you did it, then the next day you have this second trial. It's called the punishment phase, where the jury decides, are we going to sentence this person to life or sentence this person to death? And the thing is that the lawyers are the same. It's the same lawyers, the same jury. And so you have on day one the jury coming back and saying, we didn't believe the lawyers representing the defendant when they were telling us he didn't do it. And so now, the very next day, those same lawyers need to persuade the jury that didn't believe them on day one that the jury should spare their client's life. And so why is it that the jury's going to believe them on day two when they didn't believe them in day one? And that's just one of the problems that you have in death penalty trials, which is that we have the same lawyers, the same jury, and the punishment phase happens immediately after the first phase, which is called the guilt phase. And what the lawyers don't have any more of is credibility, which is that's their stock and trade, is credibility with the jury. And if the jury hadn't believed them on the first day, they're almost certainly not going to believe them on the second day. And it's the reason that there are very, very, very few cases where a jury comes back and sentences somebody to life rather than death, nationwide, but including in Texas.
So in your book, we aren't going to go any further than the trial, but it's fascinating to walk that far, and then what happens afterward, of course, is why you're going to want to read this book, right? And you can decide for yourself whether you agree with how it plays out. There's a certain, Patrick and I both mentioned, there's a certain suspension of disbelief you have to achieve in order to go through it. But I thought it was fascinating. So, and my question for you is that I don't see a sequel to this book. So, and hardly anyone ever signs a one-book contract. So, are you working on something else?
I am. So I wrote. This is my second book. This is my second novel. It's just the first one that's published.
Gotcha.
And so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to return to the first novel that I basically abandoned because a number of people, starting with my wife, but then there were a long train of people afterwards, told me that I had to have at least something hopeful happen in the book, because people are just not going to read a
You
book
go,
where
girl.
you just have one person after another jumping off of a building, sort of thing. So I finally figured out a way to do that with this other book, where previously there was nothing hopeful that was happening. So yeah.
Something hopeful is good. You also
Yeah.
need at least one person in a book to like.
Yes.
You've achieved a double score here because you like both the husband and the wife in this book.
Yeah, and the son. Her
Yeah,
son, I really like her
exactly.
son. And I actually like, Raphael meets some inmates on death row,
Yeah.
and I really like
Yeah.
some of them. And in my own life, I mean, I've had clients. All that I do is death penalty work, so all my clients start out on death row, and I meet them. They're on death row, and I've had clients who, to my amazement, I'm actually very fond of. And then I obviously have clients who I completely detest and dread having to go see them.
Yeah.
So I'm not a romantic who says everybody on death row is a misunderstood genius. A lot of them are people who, if you don't have to spend any time with, you wouldn't.
I was going to ask you. I was talking with there's a writer named Don Winslow.
Yes,
He has a
sure.
book out called The Border. Anyway, we're talking about kind of the current situation with incarceration in general, and how at some point in the, I think he said it was the early 70s, the emphasis went away from rehabilitation.
Yes.
And there were all these programs in place, rehabilitation, and to just strictly punishment.
Yes.
At some point. And you really get a view into that in this book.
Yes.
The effect on somebody who might be innocent, and then if they weren't damaged going in, they certainly are when they come out.
Yes.
Don't you think that Prisons for Profit also has something to do with that, Patrick? Remember Lisa Scottolini was talking last week about one of her books is based, the whole premise of the plot is that the jury system is rigged in this one county because the prison or whatever it is, they get paid per head for each kid that is
Right.
incarcerated in this for-profit system, and so it's a completely corrupt system.
Yes.
But I do think that, once they decided to go into it's not like the post office, where you keep hoping they might actually figure out how to run it for profit, but prisons I don't think should be run for profit, and I do think that it affects the whole rehabilitation idea. They have no incentive, for
Well,
running.
I mean, who cares what I think? But I mean, for nonviolent offenders, particularly, that are in there for drug charges and things.
Well, the other thing that happens even in prisons where you have violent offenders, there are a lot of violent offenders who are violent offenders because all that they've ever known in their lives is violence. I gave a TED Talk on the death penalty 7 or so years ago, and I had a line in it that people have reminded me of many times where I said, you tell me the name of a death row inmate and I'll tell you his biography. And it's because basically 98% of the guys on death row, they have essentially the same biography. They're violent because they grew up amidst violence. And once upon a time, I think Winslow's timing is about right, until the early 1970s, the way prisons were designed was with the expectation that people would get out of prison. And so what that meant was that what you needed to do while the person was in prison is to break that cycle of violence. And there is a conflict or a tension between having a prison that is architecturally designed to accomplish that and a prison that is architecturally designed for maximum security. The way you have maximum security is you put somebody in a cell and you don't take him out. You dig a deep hole in the ground and you drop the person in and you give him a bucket and you throw down a sandwich twice a day. You have perfect security. But you also then have a human being who during that period of incarceration loses whatever small connection he had to humanity. The alternative is that you have prisons where there's socialization, where guys are together, where there's classes, where there's group exercise, where there are more than one person in a cell. And that has more socialization, but it also has greater risk, particularly for prison guards. And beginning about the mid-1970s, prisons just decided, let's just give up on the whole rehabilitative ideal, and started to design prisons that are single-mindedly focused on security. So the guys on death row, for example, they spend 23 hours a day in a 60 square foot metal box. Most days it's actually 24 hours a day. They're supposed to have 1 hour a day outside of their cell and have what's called an hour in the day room, which is just a larger cell, but they're still by themselves. And that's how they're kept. And so if you keep people in those conditions, you're guaranteeing what that person is going to be turned into. If you're not crazy when you go into prison, the conditions will make you crazy. And that's just because in the trade-off between an architecture that is conducive to rehabilitation versus an architecture that is conducive to security, all of the states have veered strongly toward the security end of that dichotomy.
Right. Now, have you witnessed some executions?
Yes.
Do tell.
Well, I don't like witnessing executions, but if somebody asks me to watch him die, then I'm not going to say no. It's obviously more important to this person that there be somebody there who he knows than it is to me that I not be there. The only time I would actually say no when asked, I've only been asked actually 3 times, and I only went twice. And the time that I didn't captures what I'm about to tell you, which is that the only time I would say no is when I know that I'm actually going to still be working on the case up until the very moment of the execution. There are many times where we have an appeal that's still pending on the day of the execution, but it's not terribly common for me to actually still be working on the case on the day of the execution. I had a client who was scheduled to be executed last month, March the 28th. He was not, in fact, executed, and we were still working on that case on the Thursday that he was scheduled to be executed, and didn't end up getting the stay of execution in the Supreme Court until about 8:30 that night. He was supposed to be executed between 6 o'clock and midnight. So if I know I'm going to be working on it, I say, you're going to need to decide between whether you want your lawyer working on your case or whether you want your lawyer witnessing the execution. But other than that, I just hope that I don't get asked.
I think I would like to conclude, and then you guys can ask questions, by saying, despite all this conversation, this is actually, in its own way, a feel-good book. It is not a book where you are going to go away, depressed or thinking about, I mean, it's really a lovely book. They're the people in it are, the relationship is great, and, you have to root for our guy, way he deals with it all.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
I really was very touched by it, and that's why I'm recommending it to you. I think you'll enjoy it, and if you too are on a quest to find something you haven't read before, then there's your chance. We also, next Saturday, have another debut author named Welchuk, who I think has written a book again that is not in the common way, but it's much more of a straightforward thriller. But, it's exciting. We get these little clusters, of stuff, and then we have long stretches where we really love books, but we've seen this before, and, then you have to like them for other reasons. So, do any of you have questions that you would like to ask?
Are you familiar with the case here in Arizona? They called him the Snaggletooth Killer. He was twice convicted and sent to death row, and he was actually innocent. Ray Crone.
Yes, of course.
Familiar
Yeah.
with him?
Yeah.
That's a terrible story. I've seen it so many times on HLN, and every time it just frustrates me so bad.
Yeah, and actually, Ray is one of these guys who goes around to innocence conferences and things like that and talks about how what happened to him did happen to him. And so this is a weird thing to say, but as horrible and tragic as that story is, he came out of it the other end whole and is about as good at communicating to people how that can happen as anybody I've seen.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to say too much, but if you've never had someone close to you sent to prison, you think, oh, just lock them up and throw away the key.
Yeah.
Changes your whole perspective if you have to go visit someone in prison.
Changes your whole perspective if you get to know somebody in prison, even if you didn't know him before he went there. And I think that that's one of the reasons that it makes it very easy for most people to just say, lock them up and throw away the key, because most people who come to events like this, they don't know people in prison.
Well, and some of them do come out and make a
Yeah.
change in their life.
Yeah.
I can attest to that too.
Yes, that is correct.
Anyone else?
Yes.
There's excuse me, a movie that I just saw a couple of days ago, and it's called The Mustang, and it's also about prisoners in Texas and how they worked with them. They had the prisoners work with these wild Mustangs
Yes.
to train them, and this was a whole program, a learning program. And they said 90% of the prisoners, after they worked with these Mustangs, were rehabilitated.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
Did you see that? Or
I
did you read
didn't
that?
see it.
That was
There's
really
there
interesting.
are programs. There's another program like that where
It was in
prisoners
the
work
movies.
with dogs.
Dogs.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and
It's
it's,
forging a connection, it's what
it
you were
forges a
talking
connection.
about.
It makes you
Yeah.
responsible for another life. You
Right.
know, and it yes, and that's why, you know, I mean, I'm not Pollyannish about these things. I certainly acknowledge that there are some people who are really not capable ever of living in society without being dangerous. But it's not most of them. You know, it's some of them, not most of them. And I think that we have this notion that in fact it's almost everybody in prison who fits that description. And I've been around prisoners now for almost half my life. And my experience is that that's just completely inaccurate.
Did you have a question, sir?
Yeah, excuse me, I read a book recently. I have to admit I got tricked because the introduction was by John Grisham, and I thought it was a John Grisham novel. But it's a non-fiction book about the Mississippi
Yes.
medical system. I wondered, do you have
Oh, the
any-
Mississippi medical system.
It's called the country dentist and the something coroner.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
it's pretty frightening. I'm a retired physician. You know, the coroner system has nothing to do with medical examiners. It's just elected.
Yes.
And I wondered if you have any problems like that in Texas.
Oh, absolutely. We have problems like that in Texas. Anytime you have somebody who is trained as a scientist, whether it's a physician or a DNA analyst or what have you, but whose paycheck comes from the police department, you have a bad system. You have a person's scientific expertise that might pull her or him in one direction, and that person's employer pulling her or him in the opposite direction. And that's really a position that you don't want to be in, that nobody wants to be in. So yes, we have exactly the same problem in Texas. Every state that doesn't have a very clear line of demarcation between the scientific community and the law enforcement community has a version of that problem.
And I think every state that elects judges has it.
Yes, that's true.
Arizona, unfortunately, is one of them.
Yeah, well, 41 states are states that either elect judges or have retention elections, so it's, Arizona and Texas have a lot of company when it comes to that problem.
Yes, sir.
I was just fascinated on how you had developed Teresa's personality. And I wondered, how can you go about thinking about this person and get that kind of a personality? It was unbelievable.
Oh, thank you. In my life, I've known some really, really good people and some really, really wealthy people. So I just combined their best qualities.
Wow.
It's kind of unusual.
It
In that
is.
sense, wealth doesn't necessarily bring out the best in people.
No, it's just hard to believe, or how to figure out how you would have done that.
Yeah.
You want to know how he built the character.
Yeah, that's right, that
Yeah.
character.
Well, so I don't know exactly how to answer that, other than to tell you that, and I've told this story before when I've talked to people about this book, but this is my first novel, as you all know, but I read a lot, and I go hear authors and I read author interviews, and I would hear fiction authors talk about how they would be writing some character and the character would surprise them, or they would learn something from the character. And I always thought, that is just such a weird thing. How can the character surprise you? How can you learn something from the character? Character is a creature of your imagination. But when I was writing the characters in this book, and Teresa in particular, I finally got it, because I felt like she was this actual person who was
doing things, and I was watching her do them, and then I was just writing them down as she did them, you know, so.
Was there a particular
Remarkable
case
character.
that inspired this book?
There wasn't no, there was no single particular case that inspired the book. The basic outline of a man being wrongfully convicted for killing his wife has a number of prototypes. There's a famous case in Texas involving a guy named Michael Morton, who was a husband who was wrongfully convicted. He didn't get sent to death row, but he spent, I think, about 7 years in prison. And then the other people who you meet inside the prison are also, they aren't actual clients for my life, but they are people who their predominant quality in the book is a quality that I've had personal experience with in terms of seeing it in somebody else.
Right.
So,
I think it'd be fair to say that only David could actually have written this book. There are other books that have come by us over the years where you think, you know, somebody else might have done something with that story, but I don't think so. I think you're the only person. And I'm looking up there at a book called Solitary,
yes.
which is
Yes.
a remarkable.
Viewed on NPR on a weekend edition Saturday, I think with Scott Simon, and it was also just a pretty remarkable interview. Yeah.
Another good one is Grisham's An Innocent Man.
Yes.
If you want something to tick you off.
Yeah, that's about an Oklahoma case.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry, Jim, did you have your hand up?
Yes. I'm curious if your two memoirs and maybe this novel have had any effect on your relationship with prosecutors. Do they read your books and how do they respond?
Yes. So, yes is the answer. And so what I'll tell you is that my second memoir, I tell a story in my second memoir that actually happened after my first memoir, where I was in a courtroom in Dallas, and the prosecutor in Dallas purported to quote something that I had said in my first book, and got it completely wrong. And so I corrected her in front of the judge and then said, she's a poor reader, but it didn't matter anyway. So what I would say is that the books have, in fact, in at least a small number of cases, been read by the prosecutors, and they don't love the books because I obviously do not portray them in a fawning sort of way, and I have a non-fawning perspective on prosecutors. I will tell you that, and I'm without being a spoiler, I'm very critical of some judges in this book, and one of my colleagues who read it when it was a draft for me, she said, you know, the judges are going to be really pissed at you. And I said, they can only kill my clients once. You know, they're already voting against me all the time. So it doesn't really matter how much matter they get. My clients are already dead. It's not like they can kill them again. So I didn't really feel like I was putting any clients at risk. And the truth is that I think my clients like having a lawyer who they feel like is willing to stand up to the state court judges.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming this evening and for your attention and for your terrific questions. Don't we have absolutely fabulous fans?
This, I will tell you all in this, and my wife has traveled with me on this most recent book tour. This is the best event we've done since we went on the road. Don't tell anybody. We'll have to edit that out of the archive. But this has just been wonderful. So thank you all very much.
You have no idea how often Patrick and I hear back from authors who've come about how wonderful you all are.
Yeah.
You're interested, you're patient, you're polite, yay, and you really, just make it a great experience for them. So I thank you all very much for coming tonight and for doing that. I thank you. It's been great. And thank you for sitting through it, even though you've done it many times before. I'm going to ask David to wander over to the little table there with the blood on it. If you'd like to get your book signed, please do. I'll put the brownies over there, and I hope you all have a safe trip home and an enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Thanks everybody on Facebook.
Thank you
Oh,
all.
sorry, I didn't realize you were still there. Indeed, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Sorry, yeah, I thought you
Yes.
were to die.
Yes. Yes.
Austin, Dallas, and then start stop.